There is a kind of loneliness that has no name in any human language, not the loneliness of a single evening or a difficult year, or even a lifetime of being misunderstood. The kind of loneliness that has no name is the kind that stretches across centuries, that watches civilizations rise and collapse from beneath the weight of dark water, that remembers the sound of a voice it loved and knows with absolute certainty that the person who owned that voice has been dust for 900 years. That is the loneliness that lives at the bottom of the Caldemeer Sea. That is a loneliness that has a name. Though no one has spoken it aloud in a very long time, the name is Solvarin. And tonight, for the first time in 1003 years, something on the surface of the world is about to make him listen. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. And if you are new here, I am so glad you found your way to this story, because this one is something I have been holding close for a while. This is a tale about the edges of maps, about the things we seal away because we are afraid of them, about the particular kind of courage it takes to sing into the dark, not knowing what is listening. Stay with me, because this story does not rush, and every moment of it is worth it. If you are already settled in, drop a comment below telling me whether you have ever believed in something that everyone around you thought was impossible. Because Myra Voss has believed in Solvarin her entire life, and she's about to find out what it means to be right. The island of Caldemeer sits at the edge of the known maritime charts like a footnote. The cartographers were not entirely sure they wanted to include, it is not a large island. It is not a prosperous one. What it is old and positioned at the precise geographical location where three ocean currents converge in patterns that the sailors of a dozen different nations have called cursed, unpredictable, sacred, and haunted, depending on which century you consult and how much the speaker had been drinking. The cliffs on the northern edge of Caldemeer drop 200 feet straight into water that is a color the locals call deep mouth blue, a shade so dark it seems to be considering whether to reflect the sky or simply absorb it entirely. There are no docks on the northern coast. There are no fishing villages. There is a sign, weathered to near illegibility, that reads in 3 languages that access to the northern shore is restricted by order of the Maritime Archive of Caldemeer, and that violations are subject to penalties, including but not limited to a formal review, a substantial fine, and what the sign's original author had apparently considered the most severe punishment of all, the revocation of archive credentials. For most of the researchers and archivists who worked in the great stone buildings at the center of the island, the threat of credential revocation was, in fact, sufficient. For Mara Voss, it was approximately as intimidating as a strongly worded letter from a cloud. Mara was 26 years old and had been employed by the Maritime Archive for 4 years, which was long enough to have been passed over for 2 promotions she deserved, assigned to 3 projects that her supervisors subsequently published under their own names, and developed a reputation among her colleagues as the person most likely to be found in the sub-basement at 2 in the morning, surrounded by documents that no one had touched in a century and a half. She was not, by most assessments, a particularly remarkable-looking woman. Medium height, dark hair that she kept in a practical braid that was always slightly coming undone at the ends, brown eyes that her mother had described as the color of river water in autumn, which Mara had at the time considered an insult and had since come to understand was actually quite accurate. She had ink stains on her hands that never entirely washed out, and a habit of humming to herself when she was working through a difficult problem. A habit that her office neighbor, a meticulous senior archivist named Duval, who dealt exclusively in tide tables, found deeply irritating. Mara was aware of this, and had never once considered stopping. What Mara had,
in lieu of conventional ambition or social ease, was an absolute bone deep, completely unreasonable certainty that the old records were right, not all of them. She was a rigorous researcher, and she understood that the historical documents housed in the archive's deeper vaults were a mixture of genuine observation, embellished observation, outright fabrication,
and the kind of sincere error that results from a well-meaning people writing down what they believed they saw in conditions of poor visibility and a high emotional excitement. But the Solveran records were different. She had spent 4 years reading every mention of the entity across 7 centuries of maritime documentation, and the consistency across accounts separated by decades and continents was not the consistency of a shared myth. It was the consistency of multiple independent observers describing the same thing: the scale, the coloration, the behavior, the particular quality of the water disturbance that preceded a sighting. Different languages, different eras, different levels of literary sophistication, all converging on the same details with the specificity of people who were trying to be accurate. Mara did not believe in Solverin the way people believe in stories. She believed in Solverin the way she believed in the deep ocean trenches that no human eye had ever directly observed. She believed in him because the evidence was there and she had done the work to read it. The particular document she had found 6 weeks before, the night everything changed, was not, on its surface, especially distinguished. It was a fragment of a larger text, the rest of which appeared to have been deliberately removed from the archives collection at some point in the past 2 centuries, a fact that Mara had noted in her research log with the specific kind of controlled calm that meant she was extremely agitated. The fragment was written in an archaic form of the coastal trade language, and it described not a sighting of Solvarin, but a method of communication with him.
the original priests of the Coldenmere coast, who had existed before the Maritime Archive, before the island's current governance structure, before what the document called the Great Sealing, had maintained a relationship with the entity through a practice called the voicing, a form of sung call that the document's author described with the phrase, "the sound that the deep water hears through stone." The fragment contained a partial transcription of one such call,
notated in a system that Mara had not initially recognized, but had eventually identified as an extremely early form of maritime signal notation, a precursor to the standardized system the archive currently used. It had taken her 3 weeks to fully decode it. When she had discovered that it was functionally a song, a short one, haunting, in the original sense of that word, meaning that it stayed with you, that you found yourself returning to it, that it occupied a particular frequency in your memory that ordinary sounds did not reach. She had hummed it to herself for days before she fully realized she was doing it. She should not have gone to the northern shore. She was aware of this.
The restriction existed for reasons that the archive's official documentation described in the vague language of maritime safety and geological instability, which Mara had always found suspicious precisely because the archive was usually meticulously specific about the reasons for its restrictions. A vague language in archive documentation was not an accident. Vague language was a choice, and the choice to be vague about why the northern shore was restricted in a document produced by an institution whose entire purpose was precise record keeping was the kind of choice that made Mara's research instincts sit up and pay very close attention. The storm that had been building off the eastern coast for 2 days arrived the same evening she made her decision, which she would later reflect was either excellent timing or the universe being very on the nose about things. She packed her measurement equipment, her field notebook, her waterproof document case, containing the decoded fragment and the kind of practical rain gear that suggested she was planning to be outside for a while. She left the archive at the shift change when the night clerk was distracted with the handover. She took the inland path to the north cliffs because it was longer but less visible. She had done more transgressive things in the pursuit of accurate data, though at the moment she was struggling to remember what they were. Before we continue, listen to this message that could save your life. Excess sugar in the blood can lead to a number of serious health complications. Diabetes significantly increases the risk of heart disease, including heart attacks. High blood glucose levels can damage blood vessels, increasing the risk of strokes. In other words, at any moment, you could suffer a sudden heart attack or stroke. Right now, if you have any type of diabetes, your life is at great risk. Stop everything now. Your health, your well-being, and your future deserve it. Click the link in the first comment and watch the video that will change your life. Watch it to the end and discover how to take the next step towards a life without limitations. Control is within your reach. Link in the first comment to watch the video. The northern shore at night during a storm was not precisely welcoming. The wind came off the water in long horizontal sheets that carried enough salt to sting the eyes, and the sound of the waves against the cliff base was a continuous low roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Mara set up her equipment in the partial shelter of a rock outcropping that the geological survey maps, which she had of course memorized, indicated had been used as a measurement post by earlier researchers before the restriction was imposed. The ledge was wide enough for her to work safely, and she had secured herself with the standard field rope as a precaution. She took her measurements. She recorded what she found. The readings were, as she had suspected they might be, deeply anomalous in ways that the official archive records did not even come close to accounting for. Water temperature variances and pressure patterns, and something in the electromagnetic readings that she did not yet have a framework for interpreting, but that she intended to spend significant time on. She filled 12 pages of her field notebook with data before the storm intensified to the point where working was becoming genuinely difficult, and then she sat for a moment in the shelter of the rock, rain drumming against her hood, and looked out at the water. It was, she thought, an extraordinary sea. Even in the darkness, even in the storm, there was something about the quality of the water here that was different from the water on the other coasts of the island. It had weight to it that you could see even from the cliff, a density of presence. She thought about the 7 centuries of records she had read. She thought about the people who had stood at the edges of their boats and seen something emerge from this water and tried to find words for it. She thought about the fragment in her document case and the melody that had been living in her head for 3 weeks. She was a scientist and a scholar, and she believed very strongly in methodological rigor and evidentiary standards. She was also, in this particular moment, completely alone on a cliff in a storm, looking at a sea that she had studied for 4 years and knew with a conviction that bypassed the rational part of her mind entirely, was not empty. She opened the document case. She found the decoded transcription. She looked at it for a long moment, and then, because she was Mara Voss and she had never once in her life been able to stop herself from doing the thing that needed to be done, she sang it. Her voice was not extraordinary. She had no illusions about that. It was a clear voice, a steady one, the kind of voice that could hold a note without drama, and she sang the fragment exactly as she had decoded it, following the archaic notation with the same precision she brought to any technical task. The wind took the sound and complicated it. bouncing it off the cliff face in ways that created strange harmonics she had not anticipated. And for a moment, the song seemed to exist in multiple registers simultaneously, as though the rock itself were adding a second voice beneath hers. She finished the fragment. The storm continued. The waves continued. She sat in the silence that followed, feeling somewhat like a scientist who had just run an experiment and was waiting for the control condition to confirm that nothing was going to happen. The water changed. She noticed it first in the pressure readings on her equipment, a sudden and dramatic shift that her instruments were not calibrated to handle, the needle swinging so far past the edge of the dial that she thought for a moment it had broken. Then she noticed it visually. The surface of the water directly below the cliff had gone in a matter of seconds from storm-churned chaos to something that she could only describe as deliberate stillness, a circle of calm perhaps 40 meters across that the surrounding waves seemed to be actively avoiding, as though something beneath the surface were holding the water aside. The calm expanded. The readings on her equipment went entirely off the scale and stopped recording anything coherent. The temperature sensor registered a change of 11 degrees in the span of time it took her to look at the dial and look back at the water. And then slowly, with the kind of inevitability that does not feel threatening because it is too large for a threat to be the right category, something began to surface. Mara had read every description of Solvaran she had ever been able to locate.
She believed she had a precise scholarly understanding of what the records described. She had been wrong about what that understanding would feel like in practice. Nothing she had read had adequately conveyed the sheer scale of the experience, not because the writers had been imprecise. She now understood they had been desperately trying to be accurate, but because there is a category of size that the human eye and mind process as something other than size. When Solvarin rose from the Caldenmere Sea, he did not appear to be large. He appeared to be present in a way that reorganized everything around him. The cliff felt smaller. The storm felt smaller. The entire known world of Mara's experience contracted suddenly into a more accurate sense of its own proportions. He surfaced slowly, the great head emerging first, longer than the archive building she had left 2 hours ago, covered in scales the color of deep ocean water at night. Each one sheened with a faint bioluminescence that pulsed slowly like something breathing. His eyes, when they opened, were the specific shade of gold that exists in the last light, before full dark, and they found her immediately without searching, with the directness of something that had known exactly where she was before it broke the surface. They looked at each other for a very long time. Mara was aware, in a distant and academic sort of way, that she was probably supposed to be afraid.
She catalogued the absence of fear with the same honest attention she brought to everything else, and found that what she felt instead was something far more difficult to name, a kind of overwhelming recognition which made no rational sense because she had never seen him before, and yet which her body refused to classify as anything else. She was also aware that her hands, which had been completely still and steady while she was singing, were now shaking slightly, though whether from fear or cold or something she did not have a word for, she honestly could not have said. She did not move. He did not move. The storm continued around them in a way that no longer seemed relevant. When he spoke, it was not with sound in any conventional sense. It was more accurate to say that meaning arrived in her mind the way that the awareness of a smell arrives, not as words but as understanding that immediately preceded the words she found to describe it, and the understanding that arrived was, "You are not who I expected." "No," Mara said, because she was Mara Voss, and her default response to unexpected information was to acknowledge it and proceed. "I imagine not. I found a fragment of a communication protocol in the archive sub-basement, and I decoded it, and I wanted to test whether it was functional. I apologize if I interrupted something. There was a pause. The quality of the pause was such that she later described it as the feeling of being reconsidered. And then the understanding arrived again. You apologize for waking me. I apologize for any disruption, Mara said carefully. Though, I'll be honest, the research implications of this conversation are significant enough that I cannot fully bring myself to regret it. Another pause. This one felt different. If she had been required to characterize it, she would have said it felt improbably like the beginning of something. And if you are enjoying this story already, please hit that like button because we are only at the beginning and I promise you this gets so much deeper. Stay with us! The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours, during which the storm gradually diminished and the temperature dropped, and Mara's measurement equipment slowly resumed recording coherent data. She asked questions. He answered them. She was not naive enough to believe she understood the mechanism of communication they were using or that she was receiving his meaning with complete accuracy, but she had centuries of experience interpreting fragmentary records, and she applied the same careful attention to the translations her mind offered her, noting where she felt uncertain, where she felt confident, where she suspected she was filling gaps with her own assumptions. He answered her questions about the nature of the ceiling with what she interpreted as a combination of precision and restraint, as though he were trying to provide accurate information while managing her ability to absorb it. She found this thoughtful rather than condescending. She told him so. The pause that followed that statement had a quality she did not know what to do with, so she moved on to her next question. What she understood by the end of that first night was this. The sealing had been performed 1,003 years ago by a council of 7 maritime mages who had operated under the authority of the institution that would eventually become the Maritime Archive. The official archive records, which she had of course read, described the sealing as a necessary containment of a dangerous entity that had threatened the shipping routes and coastal settlements of the region. What the official records did not describe, because they had been amended, she now suspected, sometime in the past 2 centuries, was the reason the sealing had been performed.
What Solverin communicated to her in that first conversation on the storm-cleared cliff was that the original reason had not been danger. The original reason had been a territorial dispute over the deep channel trade routes, in which the maritime mages had stood to benefit enormously from the removal of an entity that had, by ancient compact, certain navigational rights over those waters. The sealing had not been containment of a threat. It had been the elimination of a legal obstacle. And somewhere in the archive's deep holdings, because institutions rarely destroyed the documentation of their own crimes entirely, the original compact documents still existed. Mara did not sleep that night. She sat on the cliff until the sky went gray with early morning, and made notes until her hand cramped, and then she switched to her left hand and kept making notes.
When she finally returned to the archive building at dawn, she was so thoroughly drenched and cold and exhausted and electrified with purpose that the morning clerk who saw her come in reportedly said nothing for a full 10 seconds before asking whether she needed assistance. She said she was fine. She went directly to the sub-basement. She began looking for the compact documents. She did not find them that day. She did not expect to. The archive's sub-basement organization was not so much a system as an archaeology. Layers of filing conventions deposited over centuries, and navigating it required the kind of patient, methodical attention that Mara was very good at, and that most of her colleagues found temperamentally impossible.
She constructed a search strategy based on what she knew about the archive's historical filing practices and the approximate date range she was working with, and began working through it section by section spending her days on her official work and her evenings in the sub-basement, telling anyone who asked that she was researching a long-term project on historical tidal documentation.
Which was true in the sense that all the most effective misdirections contain a functional core of truth. She went back to the northern shore 4 days after the first night because she had questions she had not finished asking, and because she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she had also not stopped thinking about the quality of that pause, the one that felt like the beginning of something.
She sang the fragment again from the cliff, and this time the response was faster, and the stillness in the water settled with a familiarity that had not been there the first time, as though the ocean were now accustomed to the idea of being caught. Solvarin surfaced with the same slow inevitability, and his eyes found her with the same directness. And Mara, who was not given to romantic interpretation of events, noted in the part of her mind she reserved for honest self-assessment that the thing she felt when those gold eyes located her on the cliff was something she had never quite felt before, and that she was going to need some time to categorize appropriately. She brought her maps. This had been an impulse that she had second-guessed for the 2 days following its occurrence to her, because bringing her cartographic work to show to the entity she was secretly meeting at the restricted northern shore felt like a significant escalation of an already professionally and legally complicated situation. But she had been working on the deep channel mapping for the section of the Caldermere Sea directly off the northern coast, and the anomalies in the current data she had been trying to account for were the kind that pointed to geological features that the archive's charts had never accurately captured, and she had thought, in the precise rational voice she used to justify things she had already decided to do,
that an entity who had spent 1,000 years in those waters might have observational data that would be genuinely useful. She unrolled the map on the cliff ledge and held it up toward the water, feeling briefly and acutely aware of how this looked, and communicated her question about the current anomalies. What followed was the most productive cartographic consultation of her career. Solvarin did not merely confirm the geological features she had suspected. He described with patient precision the entire deep channel structure of the northern Caldermere Sea, in a level of detail that no human survey had ever captured, including 3 submerged mountain ranges that the archive's charts showed as featureless ocean floor, a thermal vent system that explained the temperature anomalies she had been recording for months, and a set of current patterns that, once she understood them,
made the navigational records of 6 previously unexplained historical shipwrecks suddenly and completely comprehensible. She filled her entire field notebook. She ran out of pages and started writing on the backs of the map sheets. He waited while she wrote without impatience, and when she finally looked up and communicated that she needed a moment to catch up, there was a quality to the stillness that she interpreted with the same caution she applied to all her interpretations,
as something adjacent to amusement. "You have been down there for 1,000 years," she said, with knowledge that would have changed everything about how we understand this sea, and no one came to ask. The understanding that arrived was one person came approximately 300 years ago. He was very frightened and he left before I could communicate anything useful. "I'm not frightened," Mara said. She felt, rather than heard, the quality of what came next, and it was not in the category of information. It was in the category of acknowledgement, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest with a weight she was going to have to think about carefully later, when she was not on a cliff at midnight with the most significant research subject in the history of the Maritime Archive surfaced 30 meters below her. I want to find the compact documents, she said. If I can find them, there may be grounds to challenge the legal basis of the sealing. I need to understand more about what the original compact specified, he told her. She wrote for another 2 hours. When she left, she did not immediately walk back toward the inland path. She stood for a moment at the edge of the cliff, and she looked down at the water, and the water looked back at her. And she was aware, in the way that you become aware of things that have been true for a while before you consciously recognize them, that she had crossed some line that had nothing to do with the archive's northern shore restriction and everything to do with the particular quality of being seen by something that was paying absolute attention. She went back to the sub-basement.
She kept looking. Now, back at the archive, things were not remaining entirely calm. The instruments that monitored the northern shore for seismic and oceanic anomalies, instruments that Mara was aware existed because she had read the technical documentation for their installation 17 years ago during a filing reorganization project, had registered the disturbances from Solvaren's rising. This was not in itself catastrophic. The instruments registered anomalies regularly, and the archivist's response protocol was to generate an internal report, review it at the weekly monitoring committee meeting, and file it, unless the anomaly exceeded a certain threshold. What Mara had not fully accounted for was that the threshold had apparently been revised upward at some point since the technical documentation she had read,
and that the readings from the night she had first called Solverin had not merely exceeded the threshold, but had exceeded it by a factor large enough that the monitoring committee had convened an emergency session the following morning, rather than waiting for the weekly meeting. She found out about this the way she found out about most things that were happening in the archive's administrative structure. She overheard it while returning a filing cart to the third-floor records room and heard two senior archivists discussing it in the corridor in the hushed, clipped tones that meant something was being kept off the general staff announcement system. She listened with the careful inattention of someone who had spent 4 years being overlooked in professional settings and had learned to extract maximum information from the conversations people had while assuming no one important was listening.
What she gathered was that the monitoring committee had flagged the readings as potentially significant, had escalated to the archive director, and had initiated a query to the Council of Sealing Successors, which was an institutional body she had known existed in theory, but had never seen referenced in any active context in 4 years of archive employment.
The Council of Sealing Successors was, according to the very dry language of the archive's institutional charter, the body responsible for the maintenance and oversight of the containment structures in the archive's jurisdiction. In practice, this meant they were the people who would send someone to reinforce the ceiling if there was any indication it was failing. Mara returned the filing cart with complete outward composure and went directly to her desk and sat very still for approximately
90 seconds, which was how long it took her to work through the immediate implications. Then she picked up her pen and continued the title documentation research that was her current official assignment, because the most useful thing she could do in this moment was be entirely unremarkable for the rest of the working day.
Internally, she accelerated her timeline significantly. If you are on the edge of your seat right now, I need you to subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because we are going to keep making stories like this one and you do not want to miss them. Drop a comment below telling me what you think is in those compact documents. I have a feeling you are going to be close. The compact documents were in Section 7 to C of the sub-basement's oldest wing, which Mara should have thought to check earlier and would have thought to check earlier if Section 7 to C had not been cataloged in the archive's filing index as pre-institutional administrative records, governance, and legal, incomplete, condition poor. The description was accurate. The condition was very poor.
The section had not been accessed in so long that the environmental seals on the document boxes had partially degraded, and she spent an extremely tense 45 minutes carefully humidifying the most fragile materials before she could handle them without causing damage. But they were there. The original compact documents, the full agreement negotiated over a period of 30 years between the Maritime Mages Council and the entity they had called, in the formal legal language of the era, the deep sovereign of the northern Caldenmere waters, were there in 3 languages, with original seals still legible, describing in meticulous legal detail not a dangerous monster who threatened shipping, but an acknowledged sovereign with recognized territorial rights,
Navigational jurisdiction over specified waters, and a mutual aid agreement with the coastal settlements that included, and she had to read this section 3 times before she fully absorbed it, explicit protection of those settlements from the major storm systems that the entity could, according to the compact language, influence through his presence in the deep channels. The sealing had not only removed a legal obstacle,
it had removed the source of the storm protection that the northern coast settlements had relied on for 300 years before the compact was violated. Mara cross-referenced this against the archive's historical weather records for the northern coast. The increase in severe storm damage to northern settlements in the 2 centuries following the sealing was not, the data made absolutely clear, a coincidence. She photographed every page of the compact documents with the archive's reproduction equipment, made 2 sets of copies, sealed 1 set in a document case with her own archival certification, and placed the other inside her personal field kit. She returned the originals to their location with the care she gave everything she handled. She made a note in her research log that was worded in the specific technical language that would be interpretable by any qualified archivist as a record of her findings and completely uninterpretable by anyone else as anything other than routine sub-basement cataloging. She was good at this. She had been practicing for 4 years. Then she went home, made tea, and sat at her kitchen table for a long time, looking at the copy of the compact documents and thinking about the conversation she was going to need to have at the northern shore. The Council of Sealing Successors sent their representative to Caldenmere 14 days after the monitoring committee filed its escalation report, which was faster than Mara had hoped, but not as fast as she had feared.
the representative's name was Archivist Commander Severin, and he arrived on the island with a team of 4 specialists and the kind of formal institutional authority that expressed itself in the particular quality of stillness that settles over a workplace when someone important has arrived and everyone is waiting to understand what they want. He was shown to the director's office. There were meetings that Mara was not invited to.
The specialists were seen conducting equipment checks on the northern shore monitoring instruments. The general staff received a brief announcement that a routine assessment of the northern monitoring infrastructure was in progress, and that all staff should proceed with their normal assignments.
Mara proceeded with her normal assignments with the calm of someone who had a very clear plan and was in the process of executing it. She had told Solverin about the council's arrival on the previous night's visit, and the quality of his response to that information had been something she had spent the following day thinking about more than was strictly productive. It was not fear. She was relatively certain he was not capable of what she would call fear in the human sense, or at least not afraid of the sealing successor specifically, because he had survived 1,000 years of the sealing's effects and was still functional enough to have the most intellectually engaging conversations of her life. What it was something more like weariness, The specific wariness of someone who recognizes a pattern and knows the pattern's endpoint, and who has not yet seen a reason to expect this iteration to be different from all the others. She had told him the compact documents existed and that she had them. The quality of the pause that had followed that statement was one she was still trying to find adequate language for. What he had communicated was, "You are one archivist."
They are an institution. I am aware of that, Mara had said. I have also read the institutional charter of the Maritime Archive more carefully than most of its own senior staff. And the legal foundation of the sealing successor's authority derives from a compact that was violated by the institution that employed them. I have the documentation. What I need is time. What he had communicated next was not in the category of information or acknowledgement. It was in the category of something she had not expected, and that had kept her awake long after she had left the cliff, lying in her apartment, looking at the ceiling, and trying to sort out the appropriate framework for what she was feeling. What he had communicated was, "Why are you doing this?" Not as a challenge, not with suspicion, as a genuine question from an entity who had been alone for 1,000 years and could not quite bring itself to assume the obvious answer. Because the records are wrong, Mara had said, which was true, and because wrong records matter, also true.
She had paused, and then, because she was Mara Voss, and she had never found a way to be dishonest about data, even when the data was herself, she had said, "And because you have been down there for 1,000 years alone, and that is not something I can make adequate sense of, and if the documentation exists to challenge the basis of the sealing, then the documentation should be used." She had looked at the water for a moment.
I am aware that is not an especially dispassionate scholarly rationale. The quality of what came back to her had no adequate translation. She had held it in the center of her chest for 2 days and continued to have no adequate translation. She was working on it. Archivist Commander Severin requested access to the Northern Shore monitoring data on his third day on the island. He did not request access to the sub-basement research records.
This was either because he did not know they were relevant or because he knew they were relevant and was not yet ready to have that conversation. Mara observed his movements around the archive with the same careful attention she had spent 4 years applying to it everything, and she revised her timeline again. She requested a meeting with Severin through the formal institutional channels,
which took 2 days, and produced a 30-minute appointment in the archive director's conference room with the director also present, which was not ideal but not unexpected. She brought the document case with the certified copies of the compact documents. She brought her research log. She brought the 7 centuries of cross-reference sighting records, organized into the clear and meticulously annotated format that she had been working on for 4 years, because she had always known in the back of her mind that this was where they were going to end up. She was calm in the way that people who have been preparing for something for a long time are calm when it finally arrives. She presented her findings in the order that made logical sense: the historical record, the compact documents, the evidence of institutional amendment to the official record, the legal implications for the basis of the sealing successor's authority in this specific case. She did not editorialize. She did not speculate beyond what the documentation supported.
she let the 7 centuries of accumulated evidence speak in the measured, precise voice of good scholarship. Severin listened to all of it without interrupting. The director interrupted twice, both times with the specific kind of interruption that is meant to suggest that the person speaking has misunderstood something foundational about the situation. Mara addressed both interruptions with the documentation.
When she finished, there was a silence in the conference room that felt to her very similar to the silence after she had finished singing the fragment on the cliff, that quality of something having been sent out into the world that could not be unsent, waiting to see what would come back. What came back initially was Severin asking to review the original compact documents. She took him to the sub-basement herself. She watched him read the compact documents with the unhurried attention of someone who understood exactly what he was reading and was in the process of revising a significant number of his previous assumptions. She had brought her copy of the official archive records that described the sealing's rationale and placed it next to the original compact documents without comment. Severin looked at both for a long time. The director had declined to accompany them to the sub-basement, which Mara had noted as significant. When Severin finally straightened and looked at her, there was something in his expression that was not what she had expected from a representative of the institutional body that had authority over the sealing. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. 4 years of research in this archive, Mara said. 6 weeks since I found the communication protocol and made contact. Another silence. "You have been communicating with it directly?" "With him," Mara said. "Yes." Severin looked at her for a moment that had several things in it. "That is not a distinction most people make." "The compact documents make it," Mara said. "The language is unambiguous. I use the existing language." He looked back at the documents.
"The legal basis question is not simple," he said, which was not agreement, but was, she had learned to read people with the same care she read documents, the beginning of someone working their way toward a position they had not anticipated arriving at. "No," she agreed, "it isn't. But it is answerable, with sufficient institutional will to answer it accurately, rather than conveniently." She had pushed back. "She wanted you to know that, because sometimes the most important thing in these stories is that someone pushes and does not move, and is not afraid of the silence that follows. And sometimes the silence that follows is a sound of something beginning to shift." The formal review process that Severin initiated upon returning to the Council of Sealing Successors took 4 months, which Mara spent continuing her official work, continuing her sub-basement research, and continuing her visits to the northern shore. The visits had changed in quality since the night she had told him about the compact documents. They were longer. The questions she asked were no longer exclusively oriented toward documentation and legal history. She was not entirely sure when the shift had happened or how to accurately characterize it, only that she no longer brought a specific research agenda to the cliff, and that the conversations ranged in directions she had not planned, and that she looked forward to them in a way that she was aware was not strictly scholarly. He told her things, not information or not only information. He told her what the deep ocean looked like in the sections of water that no human eye had ever reached.
He described the thermal vent communities, the bioluminescent systems that existed in complete independence from surface light, the geological slow-motion drama of the deep channel mountain ranges she had mapped from his descriptions. He described what 1,000 years in the cold dark felt like in terms that were not self-pitying, but that were profoundly honest, and she listened with the specific quality of attention that she gave to the things that mattered most,
which was not the attention of a researcher documenting a source, but the attention of someone who wanted to understand, and was afraid that understanding might not be enough. She brought him things too, books read aloud from the cliff in a voice she kept steady through sheer determination, histories of the surface world he had missed, descriptions of the changes in the island and the coastline and the settlements, news of what the fishing boats were catching and where the storm patterns had shifted, and what the new northern settlement that had been established 40 years ago looked like from the cliff on a clear day. She brought him the maps she was making, the corrected charts that incorporated everything he had told her and described them in detail while the great gold eyes in the water below tracked her with attention that was, she had determined after much internal review. Not the attention of something listening to a research presentation. She was being paid the same quality of attention she was paying, and she had found over the course of 4 months of cliff edge conversations that being seen with that degree of precision by something that had existed for longer than the institution that employed her was an experience she had no adequate prior category for. She told him about her childhood,
about the coastal town on the mainland where she had grown up, watching ships disappear over the horizon and wondering what was underneath rather than beyond. She told him about the specific quality of frustration she felt every time a piece of work she had done was attributed to a colleague with a more senior title, not because she wanted the credit for its own sake, but because the pattern represented something about how institutions decided whose observations were worth taking seriously. He listened to this with what she read as focused attention, and what he communicated back was not comfort exactly, but recognition, the understanding that arrives when something hears what you actually said rather than what it expected to hear. She had not expected that. She had not expected any of this. She had expected to find a legendary entity and document its existence and present the legal case for the challenge to the ceiling, all of which she was doing. She had not, in 4 years of research and preparation, accounted for the possibility that the legendary entity would be paying attention to her in the same way she was paying attention to him. "What will you do?" she asked him once, on a clear night in the 3rd month, when the sea was very still and the bioluminescence in the water below the cliff was making the darkness look inhabited. "If the review process fails, if the council decides the ceiling's basis is not a sufficient legal ground for dissolution," the understanding that arrived was careful and precise. He would remain. The ceiling would hold. He had survived 1,000 years, and he would survive more. "That is not an answer to what I asked," Mara said. A pause then. "I have learned in the past months what it is to not be waiting for nothing. If that becomes waiting for nothing again, I will survive it."
but I would rather not. She sat with that for a long time. I would rather not either, she said, which was also not entirely the answer to what she had asked, but which was, she thought, accurate in the way that mattered. This is the part of the story, and I need you to stay with me here, where everything is held in suspension, where the outcome is uncertain and the thing between them is real and fragile and not yet resolved. And this is often the truest part of any story. It is also the part I find most beautiful because it is about what it means to reach towards something that might not come back to you, and to reach anyway, and to mean it. If this story is doing something for you, if it is sitting with you the way it is sitting with me, tell me in the comments. I read them. I want to know. The Council of Sealing Successors issued its preliminary review findings in the 4th month.
Mara read the full document in her apartment at 2 in the morning, having received it via the formal archival courier system, with a notation that it was addressed to her specifically by name, which was the first time in 4 years that an official institutional communication had been addressed to her name rather than her title or department. The preliminary findings were 63 pages. She read all of them.
The legal analysis was, she had to acknowledge with the fairness she tried to apply to everything, thorough and genuine. The council had commissioned an independent review of the historical documentation. They had consulted 3 external archival authorities on the question of the compact document's authenticity, all of whom had confirmed it.
They had engaged a maritime legal historian who had produced a 40-page analysis of the original compacts standing under the institutional law of the era in which the sealing had been performed. The preliminary findings did not issue a final determination. What they issued was a formal acknowledgement that the legal basis of the sealing, as currently documented, was insufficient to withstand a full legal challenge, and a recommendation that the council engage in formal mediation with the party, identified in the original compact as the deep sovereign of the northern Caldemere waters, to determine what remediation or resolution was appropriate. Mara set the document down on her kitchen table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put her coat on and walked to the northern shore in the dark, which was technically still against the archive restriction, but which she had ceased finding particularly constraining several months ago. And she stood on the cliff ledge and sang the fragment into the night without waiting for the conditions to be optimal, because the conditions were not going to get more optimal than this. He surfaced faster than he had ever surfaced before. The water settled with the familiarity that 4 months of regular visits had built between them. And when the gold eyes found her on the cliff, the quality of attention in them was, she thought, the same as it always was, which was everything, which was the full weight of 1,000 years of awareness, directed at a single point on a cliff, and finding it sufficient. They have issued preliminary findings, she said. The legal basis is formally acknowledged as insufficient. They want mediation. She paused. It does not end tonight. There will be more process. There always is with institutions, but the direction has changed. The direction is now toward resolution rather than reinforcement. The stillness in the water was complete. The understanding that arrived was not in language. I know, she said quietly to what it was, which was something she was done pretending to not have a word for. I know. She looked at the water for a long time. The water looked back at her. Somewhere in the deep below, she knew, the bioluminescent systems she had never seen but could now describe in detail were pulsing in the cold dark, patient and continuous, the light that exists whether or not anyone at the surface is looking. I am going to have a significant amount of additional work to do, she said eventually, because this was Mara Voss, and she narrated her situation as a matter of habit. The mediation process will require comprehensive documentation preparation. I will need full access to the monitoring data, and I expect there will be institutional resistance at multiple levels. And the director is going to be difficult about the question of the historical amendments to the official record, and there are going to be days when the whole thing feels impossible. She paused. But it is not impossible. I have the documentation. And I have been doing work that everyone else thought was impossible for 4 years. So I have some experience with the category. What came back to her was, you will not be doing it alone. This, she thought, was the truest thing that had been said between them in 4 months, and that was not a short list. The mediation process took 18 months. Mara kept meticulous records of all of it, which should surprise no one.
The formal mediation sessions were conducted at the archive under the oversight of the council's appointed mediator, a careful and genuinely fair-minded institutional lawyer named Ambrose, who read the compact documents with the attention they deserved and who seemed, over the course of the process, to have revised his understanding of what this case was about several times before arriving at a framework he was comfortable with.
Communication with Solverin during the mediation was conducted through a formal protocol that Mara had developed and the council had ratified, which involved her presence at the northern shore as the communication intermediary, a role that no one else was equipped to fill and that therefore secured her central position in the proceedings in a way she appreciated, both practically and as a matter of principle. There were complications. The director's cooperation was obtained only after the council made clear that the alternative was a formal institutional audit of the archive's documentation practices, over the past 2 centuries, which produced cooperation that was not enthusiastic but was functionally sufficient.
3 of the senior archivists who had published Mara's work under their own names over the previous 4 years were requested to provide documentation of their contribution to those publications, and the results of that request produced a separate institutional proceeding that Mara was not directly involved in, but followed with interest. The question of the sealing's dissolution was complex, in ways that the preliminary findings had only gestured toward. A sealing of this age and magnitude could not simply be reversed like a policy amendment. The maritime mages who had constructed it were dead, their specific methods documented incompletely and in technical terms that no current practitioner fully understood.
What the mediation produced, after 18 months of careful negotiation, was not a dissolution, but a restructuring, a renegotiation of the original compact's terms to account for the 1,000 years that had passed, and the changed conditions of the northern Caldemir coast, executed through a combination of institutional legal agreement and a set of technical procedures that the council's specialists worked out in collaboration with Solverin through Mara's communication intermediary role.
The new compact was 37 pages and had been reviewed by 4 external authorities before final execution. It restored the navigational rights specified in the original agreement. It established a formal communication protocol. It included, at Mara's insistence and after significant negotiation, an explicit acknowledgement of the institutional harm caused by the sealing and the falsification of the historical record,
which was not legally required, but which she had argued was a necessary component of any resolution that was meant to be durable, rather than merely functional. Severin, who had by this point become something closer to an ally than an institutional adversary, had supported this position. The council voted 7-2 in favor. The new compact was signed.
The technical dissolution of the sealing's containment structure was performed over 3 days by the council's specialists working under conditions that Mara documented in her research log with her usual precision, and which she would later publish in a paper that caused significant institutional conversation in the maritime archive community under her own name. The night the sealing's dissolution was complete, Mara went to the northern shore. She had not sung the fragment to call him.
She had simply walked to the cliff in the dark in the early spring cold, with the stars very bright and the sea very still. And she had stood at the edge and waited, because she knew, in the way she had known things about this since the beginning, that he would know she was there. He surfaced slowly. He did not need to any more, she thought. The ceiling was gone and the barrier was gone, and he could go anywhere the northern sea reached. But he surfaced slowly, the way he had always done, with that quality of inevitability that she had never found threatening because it was too large for threat to be the right category. And when the gold eyes found her on the cliff, it was with the same directness they had always had.
And it was exactly as it had been every time before, and it was entirely different from every time before, because the thing that had been between them since the beginning was no longer held in suspension by the weight of what was unresolved. She was aware that she was crying, which was unusual for her, and which she noted honestly. The cold made her face ache. The stars were very bright. He communicated to her something that she was going to spend a long time translating, not because it was obscure, but because some things require more than the moment of receiving them to be fully understood. What she got of it in the immediate was this: I have been watching the surface of the sea for 1,000 years. I have seen a great many things come and go. I have not seen anything like you. The feeling, said Mara Voss, cartographer, archivist, and the woman who had called a sea serpent out of 1,000 years of silence with a song she found in a deteriorating document in a sub basement, is mutual. She looked at the water for a long time after that, not measuring it or documenting it or analyzing it, just looking at it, and the water looked back. And between the surface and the depth, there was something that was not distance anymore. If you have made it to this moment in the story, please know that I am so glad you stayed. This is the kind of story I believe in. The kind where the thing that is wrong gets made more right by someone who refuses to accept that wrong. Records are the final word. The kind where the person who nobody thought to promote ends up changing the legal and historical foundation of an entire institution.
The kind where something ancient and lonely gets found by something curious and stubborn, and both of them are the better for it. If you want to leave a comment, I would love to know what you will take with you from this story. I will be reading. Epilogue. 3 years after the signing of the new compact, the Maritime Archive of Caldemire published a comprehensive revision of its official historical record for the northern Caldemire region, incorporating the original compact documents and a full documented account of the falsification of the sealing's justification.
The revision was authored by Mara Voss, who held the newly created position of Senior Archivist for Historical Accuracy, a title that had been created specifically because the process of producing the revision had revealed that the institution needed someone whose designated responsibility was ensuring that the official record reflected what had actually happened rather than what was convenient. The position had a larger office than her previous one, and did not have a neighbor who found humming irritating, which she considered a professional improvement on multiple dimensions. The Northern Shore restriction was formally lifted 8 months after the new compact signing, replaced by a new protocol that designated the Northern Cliff area as an official communication point under the terms of the compact.
There was a small signboard, properly maintained and entirely legible, explaining this in 3 languages. Mara had written the text for it herself and had been very particular about getting it right. The archive's deep channel charts for the northern Caldemire Sea were completely reissued based on the mapping work Mara had conducted over the previous 3 years, incorporating data that resolved navigational anomalies that had been causing minor shipping difficulties for 2 centuries. The reissued charts were credited in the formal publication documentation to Mara Voss, in collaboration with the deep sovereign of the northern Caldemire waters, which produced a level of professional conversation in the maritime cartography community that Mara found more enjoyable than she was perhaps strictly supposed to. She still went to the northern cliff most nights, not every night, and not always with specific questions, and not with equipment unless she had a particular reason. She went because the sea was there, and she had loved the sea her whole life, and the sea now knew her name. She went because the conversations were the best conversations she had ever had, ranging from the geological history of the deep channels to the quality of the light on the water in different seasons, to the books she was reading, to the institutional politics of the compact's implementation, and back again, conducted between a cliff and a vast and ancient presence in the water below it.
She went because watching the gold eyes find her in the dark had become, over 3 years, as familiar as any landscape that is also home, which is to say that it was never ordinary and always known. She went because she had found something true and she intended to keep it. The sea persisted. The sailing was gone. The records were accurate.
And somewhere in the deep channels north of Caldemire, in the water that no human eye had ever reached, and that Mara Voss could now describe in more detail than anyone else alive, There was a presence that had spent 1,000 years watching the surface from below and was no longer waiting to be found, because it had been found, because someone had looked down into the dark and been stubborn enough and honest enough and, in the end, brave enough to sing. Thank you so much for watching.
If this story stayed with you, please like the video and subscribe so you will not miss what comes next. I will see you in the next story.